with our grid now in place, we can actually start using it now by building the About section, so the section that comes after the header. But there's a lot more to do in this section. And so in this lecture, or to be more precise, while we build this section, which is actually going to take more than just one lecture, you are going to learn how to think about components and where to place our code in the overall CSS architecture. You'll also learn about utility classes, how to use the background clip property, especially with text, how to transform multiple properties at the same time, how to use the outline offset property together with outline, and finally, how to style elements that are not hovered while other elements are. And this will give us a really cool effect, as you will see. So this is the section that we're going to build next. So we started with the header here, and then now we're going to build this section here. Now before writing a single line of code, let's remember our think, build, architect mindset that we talked about before, right? So let's think and break it down what we have to build in this section. So first up, we have this heading here, and so this is an element of the typography. And this here as well. So this is another heading, and this is simply a paragraph. And so these should probably go into our typography file, right? Then we also have the small button here, okay? So think of this as a secondary button. So up here we have the main button, okay? And then here we have this, like the smaller secondary button. So that's the left side. And actually this is already using the grid. So we have two columns here, one on the left and one on the right, okay? And so here on this side we have this image composition here. So these three images where the one that we hover comes to the top and the other ones become smaller, you see? So we hover, this one becomes bigger and the other one becomes smaller, and we also have this green border around the image. So that's all, so that I can show you a couple more CSS properties which you can then use on your own sites in the future. So this part here, this image composition, I'm going to treat it as a component actually. So a reusable piece of code, or let's say a module, that we can use in other parts of our site. Like imagine that this Nater's company is going to grow and they will have a bigger website with lots of pages, and then maybe we're going to want to use this image composition here somewhere else, so on the other pages. And so we should build this as a single component which will stay independent and also in its own file. Okay, so that's what we're going to build here. Also, we need to set some styles for this section, this overall section, like this container where all of this is going to be inside, right? So you see it has this slightly gray background here. So this outside here we have the white background, and then here this is slightly gray, okay? And so we also have to have some styles for that. All right, so let's start with the HTML, such as we did before. So in here we have the header first. And so let's now create a main element. So this is another HTML5 element, and this is just to tell search engines or screen readers that this is really the main part of our site. So we have the header, we have then the main part, which will contain the rest of the website, and then finally at the end, we're also going to have a footer, okay? So this is like just a huge container which will contain most of our website, because that's the main part. Now, before we continue writing HTML, there's actually something that I want to show you, and that's called Emmet. Okay, so Emmet. And this is basically an extension that you can install on your text editor, like in Brackets, in Atom, and in Sublime, and of course also in Visual Studio Code. It's like an extension which allows us to write HTML a lot faster. And so from this part on, I'm going to start using that, because this is actually a CSS course, and I don't want to spend so much time writing all this HTML and make you lose your time by watching me typing all this HTML. And so I'm going to use this Emmet extension, and I highly encourage you to try it as well, and so do it alongside with me, because this will make your life a lot easier when writing HTML. And it's very simple. There's just 2 or 3 rules that you need to know, and then you're good to go, and it will make your coding a lot faster in HTML. So imagine that you want to write a div with the class test. All you have to do is write .test and then hit tab. And that's it. So it wrote a div with a class of test. And it already closed that div element for you as well. And so now you can start writing the HTML in here. So great, right? So for a div, you can just start with a dot and then the class. Now if you want another element, like a section like we want now, you actually have to write the name of that HTML element first. So section, and now the class dot, and I'm going to call this section the section about. And now I hit tab, remember, and that's it. So now we have a section called section about. Got that? So again, I highly encourage you to go download that package for your text editor so that you can follow along with me as I type the code this way. All right, so let's now start with the h2 element actually that we talked about before. So h2 dot, I'm going to call it heading secondary. Remember, we already have a heading primary for the h1, and so this one is the heading secondary. So I'm using Emmet here again. Now I hit tab, and that's it. So the text here is exciting tours for adventurous people. Okay, so let's start by styling actually this section. And where should we put this in our CSS architecture? What do you think? Well, I'm going to put it in the home Sass file. And that's because this is a style very specific to the home page, so this landing page that we're coding currently. So nowhere else on this entire website, even if it grows to many more pages, nowhere else there will be a section about, at least not one similar to this. And so this is a specific style of our home page. And this is why I'm putting it right here. So section about. And let's start with the background color here, okay? So background color, and now we have a color here. So once again, let's declare a variable for that, okay? So we have a very light gray, and so I'm going to call it color gray light, and actually I'm going to call it 1 because I already know that there will be multiple gray colors, okay? So F7, F7, F7. This is a very nice and subtle gray color, very similar to white, but it gives us a little bit, a very subtle contrast to the white color. And so let's copy that name actually and put it here. Great. Now some padding. So let's put 25 rem, let's say, on the top and also on the bottom, okay? So I'm using 25 rem here because let me show you why. So this is our page, and here we go. So you see that our section is starting right here, which actually makes sense. So right after this header, right? So we have this header, and then from here is where our section starts. But this gives us this problem that we have this white wedge here, so this triangle, and we want to get rid of that. And so we need to somehow move up this entire part, right? Now, how much is this here actually? And there's actually a way to find out. So let's take a look, and it is in the header file. So you see that the height of the header is 95 VH, so 95% of the height of the viewport. And then we know that this polygon on the right side goes until 75 VH, right? So from here to here, it's 75. And from here to here, so like to here, it's 95. And so the difference has to be 20. So 20 VH is this difference, 95 minus 75. Makes sense? So let's then do that. And to move up this entire thing, we can actually specify the top margin. So margin top, and then we give it a negative margin. And so instead of moving down, it moves up. VH, and let's take a look. And so here we go. So now it moved here up until this point. Now we have a lot of space down here, but we can always change and fix that later, okay? So for now, let's just worry about this H2 here, right? So as we were saying, this H2 is part of our typography. So let's go to that file and write our heading secondary block in there. So let's start with some basic styles like the font size. Font size 3.5 rem, so 35 pixels. Text transform of uppercase. And then let's say we want our font weight of 700. So it's quite a bold text like this, okay? So let's take a look now. And here we go. Now what's special about the H2 that we're going to do, let's take a look. Like crazy style here when we hover it, This is just to show you some more CSS stuff, okay? But what's really cool here is actually this gradient. So this gradient color that we have going on here right inside the text. So you see this side here is this light green, and it moves all the way to our darkest green. So this is a really nice effect, I think. It looks really modern. And so let me show you how to do it. So the trick is to first set the background of the entire H2, so of this entire element, to a gradient. So the background image will be a linear gradient, and we have done that before. So we want it to go to the right, so basically from the left to right, and the colors are, remember, or color primary light and color primary dark. Right? Remember, we defined them here before. So color primary light and dark. Let me actually close this one here, the mixins as well, and the package, and also the grid. So not so many files open here now. That's better. So let's take a look. And all right. Now what we want next is this gradient only to go all until this here. So we want it to stop where the text stops, basically. So how can we do that this element does not occupy 100% of its available width? So right now it's a block element, and that's why it does that. But if we change it, it will no longer do it. And what do we have to change it to? That's right. So display inline block. And if you take a look now, that's much better. Okay, and now the next step in making that effect happen with the gradient behind the text. So what we're going to do is to use the brand new WebKit background clip property. And it's so new that we actually have to use this WebKit prefix. So WebKit background clip. All right. So we set this property to text. And so what happens now is that the background gets clipped exactly where the text is. So again, we set this background clip property to text. And what this is going to do is that it will clip the background. And in this case, that's this linear gradient. It will clip it to exactly the places where the text sits. And so therefore, this background image, so this gradient, will only be visible where the text is. Now, what we want to see then is to not actually the text, but the background image. So imagine that right now we have the background image only where the text is. Then on top of that, we have the text. So let's make this text transparent so that we can see the background image, so the linear gradient. So what we can do is very simply set the color to transparent. And that's it. Let's check it out now. And here we go. So that's our effect. Let me just inspect this one and show you what happens if we do not do this transparent, right? Then what happens is that you see the text, which sits on top of the clipped background. And so we want to make this text invisible, so transparent. And so now you can see this really nice gradient. So let's now take care of this, this crazy effect that we have going on here, right? So this one. So let's go back here. And so now this happens on hover. So by now you already know how to do it with the SAS nesting. So this will translate to heading secondary and then hover. So these effects that you saw, these are basically transform. And on transform, we can actually put multiple things at the same time that we want to transform. So you already saw translate X and Y. You already saw scale. You also saw rotate already. So now let's use skew. So we can skew in the X direction as well as in the Y direction. So let's start with the Y direction. So skew, Y. And then here we specify it in degrees. So let's just say 2 degrees. Let's take a look at what happens. Now before that, let's also add a transition property here, right? Transition property and set it to all 0.2 seconds. Okay. Also to make it a bit nicer, I will also add some more ladder spacing here. So ladder spacing 2 pixels. Now I'm using pixels here and not rem. So why is that? Well, 2 pixels is such a small thing that it doesn't really matter if it's going to scale or not. It's actually the exact same thing if I do 0.2 rem, because no matter if we increase the root font size or not, this will probably always translate to just 2 pixels because of rounding issues. But okay, let's keep it like that. Okay? All right, and so that is skewing in the Y direction. Let's actually change this to like 20 degrees so that we can see a more dramatic effect, right? So something like this. So it's not only rotating, it's really skewing all of these letters. Now, we can also do it in the X direction, and sometimes this makes for really, really cool effects. We'll actually see another application of this a bit later. I'll just put 15 degrees in here now. So let's take a look again. And now it does these 2 at the same time. Let me just show you what would happen if it was only on the Y direction. And no, actually on the X direction, sorry. So on the X direction only, it looks like this. Okay. So let's put it back here, 2 degrees. And now we can also at the same time scale it a little bit. So 1.1 for example. So it becomes 110%. Also some text shadow beneath it. And this time we can do it in 2 directions. So in the X direction, let's go 5 pixels, so 0.5 rem. Then in the Y direction, 1 rem, so 10 pixels, and 20 pixels of blur, so 2 rem. And now the color RGBA. And color black, and now let's give it like 20% opacity, so 0.2. All right, so let's take a look now. And all right, so that looks pretty much like the one we have in our original. Now, one last thing is that we should actually center this entire thing here, right? And the way that I prefer to do this is to wrap this element into a parent element and then center the text from there. So let me show that to you and actually introduce you to a new concept called utility classes, okay? So let's actually put a div around this here. And the class that we're going to put here will be called uCenterText, okay? So what this class does is that it will very simply center the text which is inside of it. Let me adjust this here a bit now. So as I was saying, this is a utility class. And utility classes are very simple classes in CSS which only have one simple goal. And in this case, it will simply be to center text. Okay? And why did I do it? Why didn't I simply call it like heading secondary parent or something like that? Well, I didn't do that because I want to reuse this piece of CSS here. So this class, which will have the CSS attached. And also it wouldn't make much sense to make a whole class just for centering this piece of text, right? And so utility classes are a great tool that we should use and have in our toolbox. So actually we already created this file here for the utilities. And so let's put it now here. So uCenterText. I think that was the name, right? I remember uCenterText. Yeah, right. And so actually we just need one line here. So text align, center. That's it. And so now the text that we have here will become centered. And that's because this is a inline block element now. Remember, this heading secondary, we define it as an inline block. And so if we set the parent to text align center, then that inline block element inside it is treated as text. It will therefore be centered in the parent. So let's take a look at that. And indeed, here it is. All right, so we're making great progress. Let's now move on. And let's start by actually using our grid for the first time. So we have these 2 columns here. So let's just implement them here. So as I was saying, we can now come here simply and copy this markup we already have here from our grid test. Now we just have to fix this formattation here. But that's not a big problem. There are actually some extensions that you can download for your text editor, which will take this pain of formatting it from you. All right, so let's just put some text here. Like text content will go in here, and then in here we will have our image composition. Let's just take a look at here. And indeed, here we are. Okay, so when we did this, we actually forgot to remove these colors here. So let's quickly do that and open up our grid file again. And let's quickly get rid of this background color and of this one. So save and close. Now, another thing that I noticed here was this lack of space that we have here. So we should have some space between the H2 element and, of course, the content that comes after it. Now we could quickly go ahead and simply add some margin to our heading secondary element, right? And there would be no problem in doing so. But the thing is that we can already start thinking ahead. And so let's take a look at what we have here. So there's another H2 here. There's another one. And there's another one. And let me show you where another one is. And it's here, okay? And what you're starting to notice now is that the spacing that's behind them is not always the same. And that actually makes a lot of sense. Because remember, we wanted this element or this block to be independent and reusable across the page. But if we now go ahead and add a margin to the bottom of, let's say, 80 pixels or something, then that would influence the way that we could use the secondary heading across our page. So for example, here, we don't want any of that margin. And I think also in here, it's a different margin here as well. And so what we should do in this specific place is to use another utility class. Okay, so we're going to use another utility class here. And this one will be called uMarginBottom80. Or 8 actually, for 8 rem. So here we have another utility class which allows us to very easily set some margins across our page in a very simple way, which at the same time allow our main components or blocks or elements to stay independent and reusable across the page. So that's the reason why we used this utility class here, and that's the reason why we're going to use this utility class as well. And so what I want you to do is to always think like this, okay? That's why I'm insisting so much all the time in these reusable, independent, and all of that stuff, okay? It's because I want you to get used to this notion, to this way of thinking about our interfaces. Okay, with that in mind, let's define actually this class. So margin bottom 80 or 8 rem. And so of course later when we come to that pop-up that I just showed you, we will then have to define another utility class for that specific margin that we want by then. Does that make sense? So let's just check it out finally. And yeah, so now we have some nice spacing going on here, okay? All right, and that should be enough for one lecture. Let's leave the other stuff that we want to do. So putting the text content here and the image composition on this side, let's leave that for the next lecture so that you can take a break. So welcome back after taking your break. Let's now continue building the About section. And so this was where we took off after the last lecture. So what we have here, again, is these two headings, and I'm going to call them tertiary headings. So the third level of a heading, which means H3 in practice. And then this here is just going to be some paragraph, okay? So this is some very simple styles. So let's now very quickly implement them. But once again, before we start with our markup here. So we're inside of this column here. So we can actually right now start writing our H3 here. So again, I'm going to use Emmet, and I hope that you're already using it as well. So H3, and now heading tertiary. And the text goes like, you're going to fall in love with nature. And then after that, we have a paragraph element, which I'm simply going to call paragraph. So hit tab and then some text here. Okay. Now, if you're using Emmet already, then you can simply write lorem to get some blind text. So some text that is just like a filler text. So you write lorem and then you hit tab, and then this weird looking text here appears like in Latin or something. You could also go to a generator like this one, lorem ipsum generator, and then get some text from down here. You can even generate more paragraphs or sentences or words or whatever. So if you need some blind text, you can use a tool like that or just use Emmet. Now, it's actually not the best practice to use blind text when we build web pages. It's always best to work with the final content that's going to be on the site. But in case we don't have that, then it's okay to just use blind text, okay? And so now I'm copying this because we have two headers. And the second one says, live adventures like you never have before. So let me try it. And now it's no longer working. Well, why is that? It's probably because it's already written in here. Let me delete it just to... Yeah, it's true. And so actually you see that the text that it wrote here now is a bit different than what we have here, right? So it looks better on the final web page if the text isn't exactly the same. And so, as we were discussing in the last lecture, these are very simple styles concerning the typography of our website. So we're not really calling them components or anything, they are just typography styles. And so heading, tertiary, as well as paragraph are going here to our typography file. All right, and also the paragraph. Now this is not going to be anything really fancy here. All we want to do is to set some font size, like 1.6 rem, and maybe a font weight here as well. So let's say 700, so to make it a bit bolder. And then, such as our other headings, let's also transform it to uppercase. So text transform uppercase. All right, and as for the paragraph, let me set the font size to 1.6 as well. 1.6 rem. And now what I also want, I want the paragraphs to have a margin at the bottom. And that's because we usually use a bunch of different paragraphs, one after the other. And so it makes sense to have a bit of space between them. But we don't want any space between the last one. And do you remember how we did that? And that's right, we used the not pseudo class again. So just like this. Not, and then last child. And so we're selecting everything except the last child. So the opposite of last child. Last child is what? It's just the last one, but not last child is everything except the last child. And so let's give it some margin at the bottom of 30 pixels, so 3 rem. So let's check this out now. All right, this looks actually pretty good already. Let's just take a look. And actually, so yeah, this has the margin at the bottom, but this one does not because it's the last child. And so therefore, our rule that we applied before does work indeed. Now, one last thing we can do here with this text is to set some margin in here. Now, I want you to keep in mind what we did with this heading here. So we used the helper class to set this margin that you see here. Remember this 80 pixels, this 8 rem here, right? And that's because of reusability. We want to reuse this throughout the page. And the same thing might be true for this H3 element here, of course. And so let's now do the exact same thing. So we want to reuse it, and so we're simply going to add a utility class because we might want some of these headings with space, but others without space. And so a utility class is the way to go here. Sorry, I didn't intend to just delete that. And we want to add it here as well as here, right? And so I can use the trick that I showed you earlier with the multiple cursors. So here and now I hit Command or Control probably on Windows. And now I have 2 cursors and I can write the same thing in 2 places. So U margin bottom 2. So I'm going with 20 pixels here. And you know what would be actually better here? Instead of having these numbers, it would be having some designations, so some names. Because right now we're actually hard coding the margin in here. So this would basically be the same as having an inline style and set the margin directly in here, right? So what's really the point of having it like this here with this name already saying that it's 2, if we could just set the inline style to 2 rem, right? So let me just delete this here and call it small, and in here call it big. Okay, so this one is big, and now we want one that is small, and maybe even one that is called medium or something. So small, and one called medium, let's say. So let's make it 2, and this one 4. Maybe we can use it later at some point. And now it makes sense to have the utility classes like that, because then if we later want to change this margin bottom actually to like 4 or 1.5 or something like that, then the name still makes sense that we have here in our markup. Okay? So let's check it out. And yeah, okay. And actually I think it's a bit too much, so let's change it to 1.5. And so now imagine we would have to go back and then change it here to what? To 1.5 or 1-5. That would be weird, okay? So it's better like this. So let's hope it updates. Did not update. Well, why is that? Inspect. And yeah, actually it did. Okay, so 1.5 RAM now. And actually, since we're looking here at the RAM, there's something I want to show you. So remember all the talk that we had about the way that units are processed in CSS, right? And we talked about declared values and cascaded values and used values and computed values and all of that stuff, right? And actually what this DevTools here allows you to do is to see the computed values. And so in here we have, for example, 1.5 RAM, and then we have all the computed values. For example, we see the 16 pixels that we have. We see that all of these are set to 0. Remember that I was telling you that all of these elements, they have to have some value, right? So the padding has a value, all of 0, the margin has values, all of 0, except this one, which is 15. And then all of these properties here, they have values. And if we hit show all here, then we can actually say all of the CSS properties and all with all of their values. So if you remember that lecture, these values, they are either the inherited values or the default values, right? Okay, so we saw that we have here this 15 pixels, which came exactly from this 1.5 RAM. So everything is working just as expected. Okay, so let's now take care of this button that we have here, okay? And I'm also now seeing that this text here is a bit smaller, and actually it looks a bit nicer that way here, right? So let's cut a bit of the other text, and then of course focus on this button here. So you see that when we hover the button, from the green underline, it becomes a green background, and you see the subtle shadow here, and then when we hit it, it goes down. So this is basically the same mechanism as here. When we hit it, it goes up a little bit, and then we click it, it looks like it moves away from the user. So basically, as if we were really physically clicking the button, okay? Like hitting the button with our hand. And that's the same impression that I wanted to create here. Okay. So as we were saying, let's take away some of this text. Well, maybe not this much. Let's just finish somewhere here. Okay. Yeah, looks better. Maybe one more word or two, and okay. So this button will be an anchor. So I just write a.button text. Hit tab, and that's it. Oh, and actually it also asks me here to complete the href, okay? So I just pointed to nowhere, so that's why I'm using this hash symbol here. And if I now hit tab, you see that it will then come to this point here next, because there's already this gray cursor here. So I hit tab again, and now I'm here, and then, okay, and then I'm here. And so you see this Emmet extension, it's really, really helpful. For example, if I just write img, then it will automatically put these attributes here for me and let me cycle through them. So now I write something here, let's say A, B, C, and if I now hit tab, it will go to the next place where I can write some text. So text, and if I hit tab again, it goes to the end. Okay, so the text in here should be learn more. And then we have this arrow going on, and that is a HTML special character or a special symbol. And in HTML, we write them like that. So the ampersand and then a special code. So in this case, RARR. And that will translate into this arrow. Let's take a look. And yeah, so this is the arrow that I was telling you about. Now for a complete list of these, they're actually on my resources page. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. So let me just open it to you here, codingheroes.io/resources. All right, and then so here is this HTML entity reference by CSS Tricks. And so in here you have all these codes for these special symbols if you want to use them. But what I want to show you is this arrow, and I think it's somewhere down there. Let me see. Well, you have all these Greek letters going on here, some more Greek letters, and well, it should be somewhere here. Okay, so here are the arrows. And I really like to use these instead of using other icons, like coming from an icon font. So it's just easier to use this HTML code, okay? So if you don't know about this resource page, I have a bunch of resources here and I update it sometimes, and you can subscribe if you want to receive these updates, but of course you don't have to, okay? So let's close this again, and now we are ready to style this link. So we already have a file for a button component. So I say that we can simply add this smaller button here to this button component file as well, okay? So button text, and then we can put our styles here. So we will have some styles for the links and visited, and of course hover and active pseudo classes. So link, and by now you're already really familiar with the way we write this. So link and visited. And then we have one for the hover state. And then we have one for the active state. And this is actually pretty similar to the button that we wrote before. So let's just very quickly do this. Okay. So the color should be our primary green color. Okay. So that it stands out nicely from the rest of the text. So our green color, we are going to display it as an inline block as always, so that we can use the box model properties on it, like padding, margin, and all that good stuff. So inline block. Then we want to get rid of the underlining. So text decoration, none, because we want to put our own decoration. So our own underlining. And we do that by having a border button. And it will be 1 pixel, solid, and again, the primary color. So the exact same color as the text. And we do that because this way we can set a padding between the text and the line, which otherwise we could not. So padding, 3 pixels. And again, 3 pixels like this and 1 pixel is so small that it's not really going to change sizes if the user decides to change the base font size. And so if everything on the page scales up, 1 pixel will still be 1 pixel. Because in order to become 2 pixels, the user would have to change the base font size from 16 to 32, so to double it. And that's a bit extreme, so I mean, no one is going to do that. The same applies here to this padding. So if it's a really small unit, we can just leave it like that. All right, and now about the hover, remember how it looked like? I can actually show it to you again. Well, sometimes it doesn't really reload. I'm not sure why. And actually nothing's happening. Let me take a look why. So button text is the class of this. And button text is what I have here. So why is this not working? Oh, I see. I have an error here. So a small typo. Let's save it and take a look again. Oh yeah, so here we have it. Oh, also we forgot to style the size of this. So let's do that as well. And then remember that the hover effect is like this moves up a bit, has this shadow, and when we click, it moves down. So first things first, the font size should be like the text 1.6. And then let's take care of the hover effect. Now actually this 1.6 rem font size number here is coming up an awful lot of times. And so I think it's actually best to replace this with a variable. So if one day we want to change this 16 pixel like default font size that we have here on the page we can simply do that by changing one variable. So let's do that. And let's say font sizes, or just font. And so default font size. And I'm simply calling it default font size because that's the font size we're like using all over the place. We use it in the paragraphs, in this button text, in the H3. We use it, I think, in the primary button as well. And so let's do a variable with that. Now, please don't confuse that with, where do we have it? Well, it's not here. I know. So please don't confuse it with this 62.5%. Okay, so we already talked about this. This is just a definition to define what 1 rem is, right? So all we're doing here in this variables file now is to say basically that we're using 1.6 rem all the time, and so we're using a variable for that. So I know that we use it here in the heading tertiary exactly, and down there as well. So default font size here and here. So let's save it here in the typography. And the utilities, I can close it. The main, I can also close it for now. And so here in the button, we also used it. And if I remember it right, we did it here as well. So yeah, font size here in the primary button is 1.6 as well. So everything is 1.6 now. So that is our version. Imagine that we have a client, for example, for which we are building the site. So you have all your site nicely set up and you're going to the client to show it to him. And he says, well, this text is way too small. I want it bigger. So what are you going to do? What do you prefer to do? Do you prefer to go to all of this code here and change font size manually to 1.8, for example, 1.8, all over the place? In the button, and the other typography styles that we saw? Or do you prefer to simply come here and change one number to 1.8 and everything changes? And you see, everything changes and the client is happy and everything is easier for you. So you just saved a lot of time and the client is happy and so everyone is happy. So you see variables, we should use them whenever we can, okay? And you can probably argue that I could use even more variables all over the place here, but I also don't want to make it too much here, okay? I want to keep it at a reasonable level. All right, anyway, let's now change this hover style. So background color, you saw it was this green as well. So default, actually color, primary. The text changed to white. So color, white. And we have some box shadow going on. Remember, it's 0 in the X direction, 10 pixels or 1 rem in the Y direction. Let's put 2 rem for the blur, and then the color, RGBA, color black. You're already used to writing this. Then we're going with 15% here. So please feel free to play around with all these numbers to get a better feeling for them and to see what looks best. I just don't want to lose a lot of time by doing that now in here, because otherwise we end up with a course with 50 hours and that's way too much. But again, please play around with these values. Okay, and finally, I'm translating the button in the Y direction for 2 pixels, so minus 2 pixels actually. So we're going to move it up as we discussed earlier. Okay, so and since we want this to be animated, all of it, let's add the transition property here. Transition all 0.2 seconds. All right, and finally for the active, we want the box shadow. Let's actually copy this. So the box shadow of 0.5 rem, and then here just 1. And to translate it, we can actually move it back to its initial position, so 0. So let's take a look. Can close this. Well, something's not working here, at least not with the hover. Let me see what that's happening. Ah, all right. Maybe you spotted it already, but somehow I did not. And so, yeah, now it's working just fine. You see? Check. Okay, and now with this part gone, with everything working as expected, you should probably take another break so that this video doesn't become a 1 hour long video or something. So this is part 3, and hopefully the last part of building the About section. So this is what we want to build. So we have these 3 images here, and when we hover one, it comes to the top and it will have this gray-like border around it, okay? And also, when we hover one, the other ones become smaller. So you see, this one grows and the other ones become smaller, right? You see that? Okay, so let's now do that. And we start with the HTML again. And so let me show you some more Emmet magic, okay? So we're gonna start with a div called composition, because that's what our component is going to be called. So composition. And now right from this Emmet abbreviation, I can actually continue writing it like this. So now I'm defining the children of this composition class. So what I want right now is to have an image with the class composition photo. So remember the BEM methodology. So this is the block and this is the element. And we have to repeat the name of the block in the class name for the element. So again, this is the element inside of the block. Now these 3 images that we're going to put here, they are completely different. So let me show you again. They are, for example, at different positions. And so we need for each of them also a modifier. Remember, so BEM stands for block element modifier. So we have the block, the element, and now let's also add a modifier. And so we add a second class. And in Emmet, in order to do that, we just use a second dot. So composition photo again, and then remember for the modifier just dash dash, and then P1, which stands for photo or for picture 1, okay? All right, and now we want it 3 times. So we can just put parentheses around here, times 3, and now hit tab. All right, and here we go. So we have our div with the composition and then the 3 images with the composition photo class, the composition photo P1, and then we just have to change 2 and 3 here. But for now, let's just fill out these image sources here, okay? So img, and then this one is called net1, and actually not that one, so JPEG, okay? So now the alt, let's simply call it photo1, and not make a big deal out of this alt. And all I did now was to hit tab, and it went to this next source definition here. So img net, and as you can guess, this one is going to be called the number 2. I hit tab again, and it goes right to the next place where I want to write some text. So this is really smart, really intelligent. It knows what I want to do. I hit tab again, and this is the next place where I want to write some code, of course. And now the number 3. And now photo 3. And now let me just change this here, so 2 and 3. And that's our markup. So 3 images with 3 alt texts, they all share the same element class, then each of them will have a different modifier because each of them is a bit different. Okay, and now let's create a new file in here in the components and call it composition.scss. And then don't forget to edit here in the main file, otherwise you may forget it a bit later. So import components/composition. And here we go. So save and close, and here we go. So what styles do we want for the composition? Well, actually not much, at least not for now. So let's continue with nesting further down. So photo. So these are our elements. So composition photo. And actually, let's now take a look at how they look like without any styling. And so you see that it simply puts them one after the other here down here. Well, actually, I see these are very low quality pictures, and that's not the one that I want to use right now. So let's just charge this here to large. I think I remember there was like a large version of these. Let me check it. Large and large. Yeah, that's much better. So these are the high quality images that we want. And we're going to talk about responsive images a bit later, where we then can change this according to screen size and resolution, but let's leave that for later. So anyway, what we want to do now is to actually style these photos. And so let's start with the width and set it to 55%. Then we want them to have a box shadow as well. 0 in the X, and usually this is always 0, at least almost always I would say. Then 15 pixels here, and now some nice big blur of 40 pixels, so 4 rem. And the color black with, let's say, 40% opacity. Okay, we want to give them a little border radius as well. That should look nice and clean and modern. And so let's take a look at how they are looking right now. So already looking close to what we have in our original, but we want them to be on top of one another. And so how do we actually do that? Do you have an idea? Well, I would say that the best way to do it is to use absolute positioning. Okay, so let's do that. So position absolute. And remember that as soon as we set the position to absolute on an element, these elements will be placed according to a reference. And the reference is the first parent that it encounters, which has its position set to something. Now, since we want this reference to be the composition, so we want it to be positioned according to this composition element, of course, we set this one to position relative. Okay. And so now this has position relative. And so the reference, the 0, 0 coordinate, will be on the top left corner of this composition element, right? So let's now place these images in different places. And the way we can do that is to select them one by one. And that's why we have these modifier classes, right? So P1, and then the same for the others. Well, let's copy it later, actually. So we just have to define a left and a top now. So let's say left of 0 and the top of, well, I could do 0, but let's make it actually -2 rem. And so this will move it upwards. Okay, so let me just show you how it's going to look like. So this is the one. And I did it so that this image here actually is a bit on top of this text, so it's not in the same line. This would maybe look a bit strange. So now it's a bit up higher than this line of the text. So this one here is at 0, -2, and the other ones are at 0, 0, which remember is this top left corner of the composition element, which is this one here behind all of this. Okay, let's now take a look at how we have it here. Okay, so this one, then this one, and then this one. So let me copy this. And you know why this actually works, right? So composition, then photo, then P1, P2, and P3. So this helps us basically compose these class names that we have here, like composition, photo, P1, P2, P3. So let's put this one here to the right side, 0. And so what this will do is that it will start at the right side. So moving 0 pixels from the right side of the container. And then the top, let's put it 20 pixels from the top. Okay, let's check it out again. And all right, so that is the second one. So let's not change the third one as well. And I will put it even further down, so 10 rem. And then from the left, let's put it actually in a percentage value here. So why not? So 20% from the left. And so here we are. So this is how this looks like. Of course, once again, I encourage you to play around with these numbers. I already knew the way that I wanted to place this, and so I knew how I wanted the numbers to look like. But you, of course, can experiment with them and change them, right? Okay, and now we're ready to implement the hover effect that we saw here on the page. So again, it creates this green border, and it zooms in on this image and zooms out on the remaining images as soon as we hover over one of them, okay? So let's now implement that. Now, just one word about why we used all these percentages here, okay? It's because of something that I talked about a couple of lectures ago, which are one of these ingredients of responsive web design. So one of them is flexible images. And so you always have to define the width of images in percentages if possible, because this way it will nicely scale with the viewport. And the same thing here applies with the left distance that I wanted here. It's also in percentages. Let me just very quickly show it to you. Without even any media queries here already, we see that this adapts nicely to the page. Well, actually this is not, sorry, this is the original version, of course. So you see that it decreases and it's not overlapping the text. So of course it's missing the media queries to make it look better on other screen sizes, but it's more than enough for now. What matters is that we already defined it in percentages to start with. Okay, but let's now implement the hover effect, okay? So hover, and what we want to happen is, of course, the zooming. So transform, scale, and I will scale it to 1.05. So not a big difference, just like a subtle difference, but still clearly visible. Then the box shadow is also going to change, because if it's now bigger, it should give the impression that it's closer up to the user, and so it should cast a bigger shadow. And so let's increase that shadow, okay? So bigger shadow and also a bit darker. And now the third thing was that it overlaps all of the other images. And so how do we do that? How do we say that if we have 3 images, we want one of them to be on top of all the others? Well, we use the z-index, right? And so let's set a z-index on all of the regular images. So z-index, and let's simply put something like 10. It's not really important. Then here we set one that is higher. So z-index 20, for example, okay? And so now this one will always have the highest z-index, and therefore it should be displayed on top. And now just for the animation effect, a transition of all the properties in 0.2 seconds. All right, let's take a look. And yeah, so what we just implemented actually works just fine. Now let's take care of that green border stuff. Now you see that there's a space between the border and the images, right? It's not just a border. And that's actually not so easy to implement, at least not with the CSS properties that everyone knows. And that's what I'm going to show you, some lesser known CSS properties. So first up, we set the outline property here in the hover state. So outline, and let's say we want 15 pixels, so 1.5 rem. Then we stated solid, and then the color. So our green color. And this is similar to setting it to a border. So if we had border, then it would look, for now, it would look the same. So this is it. It would look like this. But with the outline, we can do something that we cannot with the border. And that is the outline offset. So outline offset. And we can say we want 20 pixels here. So 2 rem. And then it will give us this space between the border, or we should actually call it the outline, and the element on which the outline is applied. And this is it. It actually also zooms in a bit like the image. And so this is the effect that we have. Well, not exactly, because what's missing here now is that the other images decrease in size. So let's do that final thing as well. And do you have any idea how we could actually pull this off? How we could implement this thing? It's not really easy, but it's actually just a one-line selector. So what should this selector look like? Maybe take a second and try to think about what happens and how we could write down the selector for this, okay? So I want you to pause the video and think about it. And if you don't come up with a good solution, it's no problem at all. But what I want you to do here is to think, okay? Thinking is really important, because CSS is not just some stupid or dull language. You also have to think and come up with solutions for these different stuff that you want to do. So let's try that. All right, did you manage to do it? Again, if not, no worries, it's absolutely no problem. It's not really expected at this point, because again, this is rather complex. Now, this is how we do it. So, hover on the composition actually. So, we start with the hover state on the entire composition. So as soon as we hover the composition element, then select the photo that's nested inside of it, and then select the one that is not hovered. And it's as simple as that. Okay, does that make sense? Let me actually write this out for you here outside as a comment, just to make it a bit more visible. So composition. So this is what this looks like. So when we hover the composition, then select the composition photo, which is not hovered. So this maybe looks a bit crazy, but it works. And let me show it and prove it to you. Transform, scale, and let's scale it down just a little bit, or maybe 0.9, so we can see it better. And yep, so it works. So notice that it happens as soon as we enter any of these elements. And so the other ones are not hovered, and so they shrink exactly like we determined. And 9 is actually a bit too much, so let's set it to 95 again. Reload, and that's the effect we were looking for, right? Let's compare it. Yep. Actually, this one is a bit more complete, and that's because we just left out one single small thing, because in here we not only scale it, but we can also translate it a bit in the Y direction, so we can move it up a little bit. So I'll just move it up by 5 pixels, and it will make the animation look even a bit cooler, okay? Yeah, you see how it gets bigger and it also comes up a bit? That's it. All right, really cool. And again, you could do all kinds of crazy stuff here. You could rotate the elements and whatever you wanted, of course, transform all of the stuff. But that's not what we're looking for here. What we wanted to do is this section, and it's now done. It looks like the one in our original version. It has slightly different text, but that's not a problem. And so we hit our goal for these couple of lectures, all right? So I hope that you're enjoying the course. If you are, I would appreciate some feedback, of course. That's always 100% welcomed. No matter if it's good feedback or not so good, maybe you have something to improve in the course. Just let me know. Write me a message, an email, anything. Just let me know what you think of the course, okay? Anyway, see you soon in the next lecture.